did not say. Let me just put it to you this way, and I'm not going to say anything more about it. One time in Gen Psych, I think it was last year, the transcription for Christmas tree came out a little awkward and ended up being something that you would hear about in the human sexuality class. And of course, this was me teaching the class. So I'm like, oh, right. Okay. So a couple of quick announcements for you. So don't forget that we have a writing assignment that is due on I believe it's due on the 5th. So that's Monday. Our video project is technically, I'd like to have it by Monday, but we're going to show it in class by Wednesday, on Wednesday. So go ahead and do that. And then additionally, I have already put up the study guide for the final exam, even though the exam is 2 weeks away. So if you're thinking about taking it, give me a heads up. Yes. So how are you doing? I'm going to record it myself over the weekend because I know that everybody's going to be working on final papers and stuff. So I'm going to record it and make that available through YouTube for anybody who wants to watch it. I'll go through item by item from my own home and I'll pass it to you that way. Ariana, did you have a question?
Yeah, for the video project, are we just like showing the video or do we have to like explain it to the class?
You do have to explain the 5 things that you did and how you demonstrated them in the video. So part of your grade is making sure that you've made very clear to us how you were demonstrating it. So you can kind of think about it as kind of a very casual sort of oral defense. You don't have to have a speech prepared, but come in knowing those 5 things that you did in your video and be ready to explain those. Okay. There won't be hard questions. I won't be like, well, if this was like this, what would this be? It won't be like that. It'll be pretty straightforward. What are the 5 things you did? How did you show them here? Any other questions? Yeah. No, I don't have time to grade short answers. The final is on Wednesday and Thursday is when grades are due. And I've got meetings in the morning on Thursday. So no, very much like our final exams for a lot of our other classes, it's all multiple choice because I don't have time to grade short answers. I just don't. So you ought to be pretty good. 50 multiple choice, 2 points each, cumulative, everything's fair game. Although the majority of it, a good chunk of it is going to come from language since we're talking about that already. Okay. All right. So speaking of which, let's talk about language. Oh, I forgot one more thing. Does anybody here want some extra credit? So I've been checking the course evaluations and so far about 1/3 of you have done it. So here's the thing. I don't care what you say. I want you to be honest. Helpful feedback is always useful. However, if 75% or more of the class completes it, I will give you 5 extra credit points. Can you get that done by next Friday? If you can do it by next Friday, you will get 5 extra credit points if 75% of the class does. So if you have done your part, very gently, I might add, maybe peer pressure your classmates into doing it. No violence, please. Occasionally, I've told students this and somebody will hold their fist up and go, you better do it. I'm like, violence is not the solution. We do not do that here, but I do encourage you to get them done. The more people that fill them out, the more valid it is as a measure because it's coming from the whole class and not just like it should be an evaluation, not a Yelp review where only the people who really loved it and the people who really hated it answer. We need some people who are in the middle too. So the more of you that there are, the more variability we will have and the more valid a measure it is. Although, course evals are kind of biased in a variety of different ways, but unfortunately, like many other measurements, they're the best we got right now. So, be honest, be kind, and give constructive feedback. You suck, I hate you, while honest is unhelpful. Likewise, I loved this class, you rock, also unhelpful because there's no concrete feedback there in either case. So if you can try to focus on that, that would be helpful. All right. Any other questions? Okay, so while I'm flipping through, I will tell you a story. When I was in grad school, one of my math modeling professors was like, if you give me all 5s, I will give you all A's. And oh, I laughed at him. I said, that shows what you know. We get our grades back before you ever get your evaluations back. So we gave him 5s anyway, because he was really good, not because of what he said. And I got an A anyway, because I work hard. All right, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about some of the different properties that make language really special to us. So one of the first things that we mentioned last time that makes language special, and at least as far as we know, makes human language special, is first of all, we have units of language that carry meaning, but they're arbitrary in nature. So as we kind of talked about, this is a computer mouse. This could have we could have named this in another universe, anything else. Now, I know why we named it a computer mouse. Just look at it. However, go back to a mouse. Could you imagine a universe where a mouse still is a mouse, but has a completely different name? Yeah, the relationship between the word and the thing that it describes, for the most part, is arbitrary. And if it isn't, go back a step. So you're like, well, yeah, laptop isn't arbitrary. It sits on your lap. True. But you know what is arbitrary? The fact that it's called your lap. It could have been called anything. So we talked about the fact that units of language are arbitrary, but they have meaning. We were talking about the fact that things are displaced in time and space. And then finally, we're going to finish up by talking about the fact that units of language are discrete and productive. This includes our use of letters and words. So as we were talking about last time, language is not solely about the present state. So for example, my birthday is coming up next week, and it's a big milestone birthday. It's one of those ones that ends in a 0, to kind of put it into perspective. So I've been reflecting back on the past 10 years. I can use language to do that for myself. So I can talk about the past. I can talk about the future or things that might be. I can talk about my sister that lives in California, despite the fact that she is nowhere near me right now. So our language enables us to talk about things that are displaced in time and space. Now, compared to other species, the last time that we were here, we talked about the vervet monkey. The vervet monkey has a warning call that is arbitrary in nature, much like our own language. However, unlike us, the vervet monkey's warning calls are not discussed at a later time. They are solely about what is going on in the present. Now, honeybees, though, honeybees do not have an arbitrary, their words or the waggle dances that they do are not arbitrary in nature. However, it says arbitrary right there. So no, I am wrong. That's what I get for talking before I look. So honeybee communication is arbitrary in nature. We could have used any way to describe how far away a flower source or a food source is from the sun, but we chose this method. And it does indicate displacement. What it doesn't do is that the units of the waggle dance are not discrete and productive. So again, meets most of the requirements for a language, but it's missing that third one. So I do want to show you the waggle dance. If you were watching this on a recording, because I know that some of you are sick, I am going to pause this really quickly so that we can watch the video and I don't get hit with a copyright claim. Okay, so you can clearly imagine a world in which that describes that angle in a very different sort of way. So the dance is arbitrary, contrary to what I was saying at the beginning. The dance looks random. It's just basically a bee wiggling. It's really cute to watch though. They're super cute. But we're talking about displacement in space. We're talking about flowers and food sources near a sun that is nowhere near the bees at this current point in time. So then finally, we have discreteness and productivity. So the three requirements for language are the arbitrariness of the language, the displacement in time and space, and the fact that the units are discrete and productive. Human language contains discrete units. We have letters. When put together, they make phonemes, which are sounds, units of sound, and those letters also make our words. We can combine those words in a variety of different ways to make sentences. So the question is, do other species communication systems actually have this? So as you can kind of see with the bee dance, there aren't really discrete units there. That dance is always going to be the same, and you can't recombine different elements of the dance. What's interesting, though, is that the monkey warning calls, that vervet monkey call that I mentioned, while it does not indicate displacement in time and space, you can actually combine them. So there's a different warning call for a panther, and there's another warning call for a rival group of monkeys. You can combine those if both are present at the same time. So there is discreteness and productivity. So some communication systems contain many of the same elements that make up our language, but every single one of them that we've talked about is missing that 1/3 thing to truly make it a language. Now, as I've mentioned, it is possible that these animals actually do possess a language. We just don't have the technology or the capability at this point in time to figure that out. So I would say, and you're going to hear me say this a lot when we talk about animals communicating, as far as we know right now, animals don't possess a language, but that could change as we gain new information. That is the first one I've had all day. Been trying to drink my water. Okay, does anybody need some more time here? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about whether or not apes can learn language, because one thing that we know is there's a very, very long history of us trying to teach different primates languages. And it kind of makes sense as to why we would be interested in doing so. These are our closest relatives in the ancestral chain. If you're going to teach an animal to learn a language, you should probably teach an animal that is the closest to human that you can get. So there have been a lot of early attempts to teach apes language. Many of you may have grown up hearing the story about Coco the gorilla. When I was growing up, I had a book called Coco's Kitten that was all about Coco the gorilla learning to sign. And one thing I will mention is that in a lot of cases, teaching animals to use sign language can be beneficial. They do learn signs for words. Coco did, and another ape named Washoe did. However, one of the things that we know about teaching apes sign language is that while they learn the signs for certain words, they don't understand the underlying syntax or grammar. So you and I know that an adjective always comes before a noun, right? It's a descriptor. You're trying to describe a noun. When apes like Coco or Washoe try to sign, they will put an adjective before a noun or after a noun. So there's not that same underlying understanding of syntax. But I would still say it's a pretty impressive feat. So teaching apes sign language seems to be one of the best ways to teach them to do this. But I want to talk about some early attempts that were really bad. We're going to talk about work by Donald Kellogg and his wife, basically trying to raise a chimpanzee here named Gua along with their son. And the reason that I know about the Kellogg story is that when I was at Florida State University, Kellogg was the name of our experimental psychology building. It was the creepiest 1960s building I've ever seen and had no windows. The only person who got windows was Anders Ericsson. His office was huge. He's the one who came up with the 10 years or 10,000 hours rule along with Herb Simon. But I want to tell you a little story about it. So these were researchers around Florida State. So this is Winthrop Kellogg and then his son, Donald. History contains numerous accounts of children raised by animals. The children in such cases often continue to act more animal than human, even when returned to human society. The psychologist Winthrop Kellogg wondered what would happen if the situation were reversed. What if an animal were raised by humans? Would it eventually act like a human? To answer this question in 1931, Kellogg brought home a 7-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua into his home. He and his wife then proceeded to raise her as if she were human, treating her exactly the same as they treated their 10-month-old son, Donald. Donald and Gua played together. They were fed together, and the Kellogg's subjected them both to regular tests to track their development. One such test was the suspended cookie test, in which the Kellogg's timed how long it took their children to reach a cookie suspended by a string in the middle of the room. As a child, doing that with tiny little donuts for parties, I hate that. I hate it. Gua regularly performed better on such tests than Donald, but in terms of language acquisition, she was a disappointment. Despite the Kellogg's repeated efforts, the ability to speak eluded her. Disturbingly, it also seemed to be eluding Donald. 9 months into the experiment, his language skills weren't much better than Gua's. When one day he indicated that he was hungry by imitating Gua's food bark, the Kellogg's decided that the experiment had gone on far enough. Donald evidently needed some playmates of his own species. So on March 28, 1932, they shipped Gua back to the primate center and she was never heard from again. Okay, she was safe at the primate center. She just never went to live with the Kellogg's. However, this is not the first instance of a human being bringing an ape into their home to try to teach it to be more human as an attempt to get language. Terrace and colleagues had a chimp by the name of Nim Chimpsky, and they tried to teach it sign language. And unfortunately, Nim was occasionally a little violent because he was not meant to be around humans in that way. Also, chimps are really strong. You may be bigger than them, but they can really hurt you. So you need to be careful. But if you're interested in learning more about the case of Nim Chimpsky, there's a documentary called Project Nim that came out back in 2010 that you can also learn about. Now, here's what we know about apes learning language. So yes, there's Nim Chimpsky. They also tried to teach him to sign. So here's the thing. An ape is never going to be able to talk like you or me. I know, watching the Jungle Book animated lied to you. King Louie is not going to show up and sing about how he wants to be like you using your language. That's not how it works. Now, part of the reason for that is that our vocal apparatus evolved adaptations to actually enable speech. This is not present in chimps. And by the way, when we're newborns, we don't exactly have that apparatus fully formed either. So if you've ever heard a newborn cry, they kind of sound like this, don't they? It's very guttural sounding. That's because the larynx hasn't dropped. The vocal apparatus has not dropped. And it is only once that drops where we start to begin to get the capability to actually learn language. Now, most people have figured out you're not going to be able to get a chimp to actually talk like a human being would. So what you're going to have to do is teach them something like ASL. And so I've talked about Coco. I've talked about Washoe, and Terrace and colleagues, as I mentioned, had Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky successfully learned over 100 different signs, but he wasn't able to use the language productively or with a syntax. You could potentially describe this as what is known as pidgin English. It is speaking English, but not necessarily with its proper order or syntax. And one of the things that we know is that with kids that are raised alone and don't get sufficient exposure to language by about the age of 7 or so, they can learn words, but again, they will not have those underlying grammatical structures and syntax. They won't have those intuitions that you and I have. And we'll talk more about a critical period very soon. Hey, everybody good? Natasha, do you need a look? Oh, you're reading ahead? Nice. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the case of Kanzi. Now, this is a really old picture of Kanzi. And I would also add, Kanzi is incredibly controversial. Although, to be completely honest with you, all of these animal studies that I've been talking about are really controversial. But in general, one of the things that we know with Kanzi, I mean, ethically already, it's kind of an iffy study, but there are some things such as the area that Kanzi is around isn't large enough to move around in. There's issues related to mating and finding mates, and Kanzi not really having any other apes to be around. But all of that aside, and that is really controversial and definitely worth considering, Kanzi is probably one of the best examples of an ape that can learn language, not by sign language or by imitation, but by using an artificial language that is called a lexigram. So how many of you have seen things like hieroglyphics, or you've seen things like in Japanese, things like kanji, in Korean, things like Hangul and stuff like that, like those pictorial representations of language. A lexigram is actually like that. It's a picture, but it has an arbitrary relationship to the word that it describes. So we're going to look at a couple of examples of kanji, looking at lexigrams and demonstrating linguistic knowledge. And part of this was learned through observation, and researchers have estimated that he has the equivalent of a 2-year-old in terms of comprehension. Now, 2 years old doesn't sound like much, but for if you've seen a 2-year-old human talk, they actually sound pretty adult-like at certain points at the age of 2. So this is pretty impressive. So you can finish writing this down, and then we'll watch a video of Kanzi's abilities with lexigrams. I heard I might be getting an electric blanket for Christmas. I could have used that last night. I went to go to the biology capstones and the temperature dropped, and I said I was going to walk. And my partner goes, "Are you sure about that?" I'm like, "Yes, it's going to build character." It didn't build character. No, and Sada heard me earlier today. I am such a mom when it comes to y'all, because like y'all be walking outside in your hoodies and stuff, and it's like 25 degrees. I'm like, where are your coats? You're gonna die of cold. You're gonna it's like, and I'm not even kidding. I am starting to become my mom. I told her I was going out with wet hair a couple of months ago, and she goes, "You're gonna catch a cold." I'm like, "Mom, that's not how viruses work. They don't just suddenly jump on your wet hair and give you a cold." Okay, are y'all ready to see some kanji? It's really cool. And I want to see what you think about it too. And once again, we got to pause share. We got to pause recording.
I worked at the Maddox Skill Center for my clinical, and they did that with kids with autism. They
Yeah.
couldn't speak. I thought it was the weirdest, but it was like so cool because they would have different pages and they had learned that the word wasn't on their page. They learned to recognize to go to different pages to find what they were looking for.
So they were doing something called facilitated communication.
I think so.
Yeah, so I will say, I think, so it depends on who you talk to. Some people are really into facilitated communication. My colleague, Dr. Abashan, is actually kind of against it from her own experiences. But again, that really comes from a lot of her experiences working with autistic adults rather than kids. So there might be some differences there for sure. But yeah, it's really fascinating to see that happen. Allie.
It reminds me of the dogs on TikTok.
Oh, the ones that are like, I love you.
Oh, no, they like
The ones
get
with the
them
buttons.
buttons.
Oh, yeah.
Button.
Uh-huh.
It has like upwards of like 100 buttons on like communicating with its owners. And then they said that it like gained consciousness or something and Bunny got depressed. Or something like that.
I'm too old for TikTok. Can you share that with me on Friday?
It was honestly really interesting, but it reminded me of that.
Anybody else? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about language and thought. So does the way that we describe the world around us influence how we think about things? So I got to talk about this. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. Wait. So, I want that thing to hide so I can see that. So we need to think a little bit about the relationship between our language and how we think about the world. So why do we communicate our internal states in terms of language? I think it was actually pretty mind-blowing. A couple of years ago on Twitter, there was an image that went around with people trying to imagine an apple. And there are some people that cannot form a visual image in their mind at all. Is there anybody here who has trouble forming images in their mind? So if yeah, I think you're right. She did mention that. Now, another one came up more recently. Is there anybody here that does not do an internal monologue? Like, do you talk to yourself or think to yourself all day in terms of language or anything like that? Do you have an internal monologue? Kind of? It's okay if you don't. We've got variability. Like, variety is wonderful. I like to think I have an internal dialogue, but I think there are times where I deliberately talk to myself, and then I think other times it's just not there. It's just usually random earworms or song lyrics. It's like in Inside Out, that gum jingle. Yeah, that gum jingle will pop into my head. Like right now, I've got like at least 5 Weird Al Yankovic songs circulating in my head because we just watched the movie. So we're going to talk about a couple of different possibilities. So first of all, we have the idea that language is a product of our thought. So that for you to have language, you have to be able to think. Now, we can also talk about the fact that cognition and language are 2 completely different systems that do interact, but do not depend on each other. And then we can talk about the fact that our cognition is dependent on language. That is to say, language influences our thought. And the truth of the matter is we don't know fully which possibility it is. I can tell you it is definitely not the third one. But when we talk about the top 2 possibilities, it gets a bit more complicated. Okay. Everybody good? Okay. So I want to go back to the behaviorists because of course the behaviorists have to take something and make it weird. I know, I'm just going to put it out there. I call it like I sees it. So the behaviorists, and this is really what ultimately did the behaviorists in. They don't know how to talk about language without bringing it back to a stimulus and a response or operant conditioning. Skinner had an entire theory about how to describe language and ultimately could not explain it better than somebody like Noam Chomsky, which is part of the reason why the cognitive revolution happened in the first place. So we engage in thinking behaviors that have no observable response. For example, I'm thinking right now. You know what I just thought about? That we have spicy nacho Doritos at our house and I really want them. But you wouldn't know that unless I told you. So you and I can think without engaging any observable behaviors. That's the great part about having a mind that nobody else can read. You can think all sorts of things and no one will ever know. But behaviorists believed that when you are thinking to yourself, you are engaging in subvocal speech. So they would actually say that in some cases, your vocal apparatus can actually vibrate slightly. And that can be picked up on something like an EMG that measures muscle movement, even when you're thinking to yourself. Now, John Watson actually did decide to take recordings while people thought to themselves, and sometimes people ultimately do talk out loud a little bit, implying that there is subvocal speech there. However, it gets a bit more complicated than that. By the way, here's a really fun fact. If you speak in sign language, you can sign in your sleep, much like people talk in their sleep.
I felt weird about that one when I wrote it down. My sister's deaf,
Mm-hmm.
and she would just make random noises in her sleep. She never signed.
Oh, well, and not everybody does.
So that's why I was like, weird.
Some can, but not all do. Just like some people talk in their sleep, some people never do. My partner does whale songs. No, I'm not kidding. One night I heard, and I'm like, I went to grab my phone to try to record it, and I was too late. But no, not everybody talks. Sometimes people do make noise, though. How many of you have had those instances where your leg jerks and you wake back up? I have actually shared this with my Gen Psych class a couple of times, but this has happened to me and I'm not ashamed to share it with you. I've been about to fall asleep and all of a sudden I'll hear somebody go, wah, and I'll wake back up and then it hits me that the person who said wah was me. That's not even a word. Okay. Now, so Watson basically believed that we think with our entire body, and he basically cited the fact that some people who are deaf can actually sign in their sleep. So if you think with your entire body, and if thinking is just subvocal speech, if this is something your entire body can do, here's a really fun way to test it. And by fun, I mean, please don't try this. So Smith and colleagues basically tried to test this theory by paralyzing. So Smith actually paralyzed himself with a drug. So the idea is that if you think with your entire body, and if thinking is just subvocal speech, stop and paralyze the vocal apparatus, paralyze the rest of the body. And according to Watson, you should not be able to think. However, when paralyzed temporarily with a drug, do you think Smith was still able to think? Yeah, he was probably thinking about how scary and freaky temporary paralysis is, because it is. Like some of the earliest work that we ever did on paralytic drugs like curare were done by people testing it on themselves. People nearly died doing that. So thought is not subvocal speech, but speech enables us with a way to think about things. But we also think in images plenty of times, and we don't use language for that. When I think about how to turn on the hot water in my shower, I don't think about it in terms of language. I think about it in terms of the image and the hand movement that I need to make. All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop here. I am going to talk about this goofy, also kind of racist notion that the Inuit have many words for snow. It's more complicated than that, and we will talk about that next time. Have a great day, everybody. I will see you all on Friday.